Good afternoon. Afternoon, everyone. It's great to be in front of all of you again. It has been great to meet so many of you in 3D and not having a sitting or meeting with many of you in front of a screen. So thank you for making it to this session, a session close to 5 p.m., which some people may consider beverage territory. It's much appreciated, so thank you for your attendance today. My name is Carlos Tagle. I have been with AWS for about 4.5 years. Before that, I used to be a customer. So it has been a great journey, and I'm part of the specialist team for migration services and for control services as well. With me today, we have Melash. Once he goes to his section, he will introduce himself as well. So what we are going to talk about today is something that we hear often from customers. Is you as AWS, you tell us you want to modernize, or we tell you you need to modernize your application, you need to go and have a more efficient architecture in terms of your applications, but the obvious question is not easy. It has plenty of challenges in terms of migrating. So what we are going to cover today it's this small roadmap of what are the challenges of refactoring or modernizing your application, how we reduce the risk around that, because in every migration there is an element of risk, an element of management. How do we decompose the application? How do we divide the different services or the architecture in its components? And then we are going to identify how do you manage that complexity. If you are able to decompose, if you are able to modernize your application, the next natural question is, what are the implications of that? How do I manage a potential additional complexity with that? Or how do you keep it simple so you don't need to have to manage the components independently, but you do it efficiently? And especially something that we will cover, or a term we will use, is the monolith application. And a monolith, in terms of definition for us, is when you have a very traditional app. And we'll talk about a traditional scenario, fictitious insurance company, which normally has very stringent regulations behind it. So we'll walk through that. And then we are going to have a demo. Melash is going to take us through the demo of one of the new features we launched on Monday. It's called Refactory Spaces. It's AWS Migration Hub Refactory Spaces. That's a new feature that will help you to walk through the journey that I just described. So we are going to go through a demo on how this operates, how you create an environment, and how we believe that this will help you to move significantly faster and manage the complexity or avoid the complexity of migrating a monolith architecture. So with that said, it's we have a reference, or we have one of our most popular blogs that we have across AWS is these different strategies of migrating. Originally, we had 6 R's. We added the 7th R not so long ago. Our general manager, Stephen Orban, wrote the original blog, which is still very, very popular. We have been updating it often. Just this week, updated it as well in terms of the functionality that we are adding for refactory spaces and a mainframe modernization service that we launched this week as well. But what this is really the different strategies, the different ways or choices that you have when you need to refactor the monolithic application. And the very first thing that you need to put in front of your leadership, in front of your businesses, of your organization, is why are you moving? Why are you breaking this monolith? Why are you refactoring or modernizing your architecture? And everything starts with the business, or what are the business reasons behind it. And we have seen the options that we see here on a slow product innovation and the different items is what customers tell us on why they want to move from a monolith to an architecture of microservices. And one of the elements that come up more often in the conversations have to do with the time to market. When you are migrating, and I think many of you may be familiar with the cascade process, the traditional waterfall effect of having an SAP implementation, an Oracle implementation that will need to be very traditional and very specific on how you move a monolith. You want to move, or the advantages is that if you have a microservices architecture, you will be able to start moving parts of your business functionality faster. So that will help. That's how we are going to walk through some of the mechanisms or some of the methodologies that we recommend for you to use to justify this business part on how do you get started with that. Because refactory spaces and the rest of the features and services we offer will help with all of that. That's the how, but we are describing the mechanisms or the methodologies that you will need to implement as part of that, or that we'd recommend that you follow working with many customers on that. And once you figure out why do you want to move, what are the powerful business reasons to make this happen, then you go to the technical part, which could be complex as well, especially having the coupling of some components. If you want to move an application, and we'll talk a little bit about lift and shift and other mechanisms now, it's complex because you need to have outages, you may need to have a way to move the functionality, and then it's not that frequent. You need to coordinate a lot of different teams to make something happen. So covering these two pieces, it's fundamental to get the project moving, because if you don't have the buy-in from the right teams on making that happen, it will not keep going. You will not have the right momentum. So we'll put an example to make all this more real. We'll put an example, and as I was saying in the beginning, we are using the example of an insurance company, which typically they have a lot of regulation. They may operate in different markets, different states in the US, different countries if they operate outside or they operate globally. So one of the things that we are putting in this example is we have the market is being challenged from all places. What typically happens with any business, including this one, is that you have a set of disruptors, a set of people that may not have all the legacy applications, or they could experiment with business models faster. So they get that pressure to go to market, to implement innovation, to do things differently in a faster way. So they are trying to grow their customer base, the typical business problems. They are looking to shift their monolith. They may need to upgrade to different versions for either regulatory or compliance or operation purposes. And obviously, the customers may not get the greatest and latest. The UI experience may be out of date compared with other potential platforms. And what we see in this particular case, and it reflects customers across industries, is that the attempts to modernize are often not successful, unfortunately, because it's when they go from on-premise or on-premise to something else, it takes a lot of effort. It's many times multi-month, multi-year journey, and the funding and the justification of that requires a lot of planning and a lot of sponsorship from the business. So the second attempt that typically we see with organizations, in this case, or insurance company, is lift and shift. And one of my favorite stickers in AWS when I joined was, because, I don't know, maybe many of you do the same. We put stickers in our laptops often. And one of my favorite ones was, friends don't let friends lift and shift. So I want to say that I have been guilty of the same when I was a customer. I like the lift and shift. So you need to try it. But in this case, they went through it for cost savings. And then once they are in AWS, they move the monolith, then they start to modernize. So that's, again, it has a subset of same challenges of what I was talking before. You need to coordinate a lot of teams. You need to identify potential outage windows depending on how you do it. And it helps, but it helps only to some degree. It doesn't give you the full advantage of modernizing in AWS. So you move from a data center to AWS. One of the aims that we have here is not only that the cost of moving or the cost of the services and infrastructure underneath an application, it's smaller, faster, better, but the cost of operating, the cost of your teams operating the application will be lower too. So what that means is that the engineering teams, your infrastructure teams, will not spend as much time attending tickets from the application. If you have a better, modern architecture, the aim is that it will be cheaper to run what you have, or faster, better, on one side, but it will be also more efficient, the amount of time that your teams put behind that. So that's what we aim to do in lift and shift. You can only go so far. So when you modernize, then you can go to a different set of architectures, but that requires, obviously, a lot of effort, or could be, in the case of this insurance application company, it requires a lot of energy from different teams, making sure that you translate every functionality or every piece that you had in the application that you move, in the monolith that you move from one place to another. So what we are going to talk now, so that's the challenges. That's giving you the example of the insurance, this fictitious insurance company that we're painting here. But the strategy that we're suggesting is aligned with a concept that was introduced by Martin Fowler from ThruWorks back in the 70s. And this strangler fig concept is this tree or this methodology that will help you to gradually move parts of your application. But in a short version of it, it's a way in which you keep your monolith, you keep your application, and then you little by little are strangling or moving the things that may not be used. And for some of you or that maybe may have international or Latin America background, I'm originally from Mexico, the translation of a strangler fig I just learned like an hour ago, it will be something like urraca rana. Which I will not get into it. I will give the credit to the head of professional services, Carlos Ordóñez, but is this process in which you are literally moving or removing something from the environment little by little. So this helps you to have the agility, the frequent releases, have a more DevOps functionality, and especially in this case of the insurance company, it lowers the risk. We put this example, and by the way, it is representative of many other industries, because an insurance company is normally managing risk. It's always trying to lower the risk of doing something. So in this case, by doing it little by little, you can sell it better to your leadership, have better results, have them faster, and then you can keep the process going based on that success. So with that said, you can have then an API gateway that will allow you to have any sort of compute, network, and other modern architecture behind the scenes. So you will not need to move to an EC2 or traditional architecture. You can use serverless like Lambda. You can use containers. You can use any type of modern architectures because you have a front. You have an API gateway that you can point your users to. And this is something that probably some of you or many of our customers have done in the past. I'm not I'm not describing a concept that it's novel or that we're introducing. This is just reflecting on what our customers have used in the past to start moving these applications, and that's the representation, or the high-level representation on this architecture. So what this means is that you can start moving pieces, you can start moving parts of your architecture gradually. And this is part of the methodology. What we are going to cover next is another part. It's the event storming. And for that, I will let Melash to start covering the next slides and then take us to the demo.
Thank you, Carlos. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Melash Mudli. I'm a solution architect on the migration and modernization team, and I help customers migrate and modernize their workloads based in the UK, hence the weird accent. And I've been with AWS for going on 2 years now. So Carlos introduced you into the strangler fig pattern and the significance of it through this process of gradually refactoring the application. But at the point we start to look at decomposition strategies and how we deal with extracting that capability and functionality, we've got to be mindful that we model the application and the services to represent the business. And one way to think of it is if you go back to your days of college or university, and when your professors were taking you through object-oriented programming, and they always the lectures would talk about how you should model your classes and your methods around something in the physical world. When it comes to refactoring your applications or building new software or new services, that's what you're aiming to get. Because if you apply that, it means that your software can basically adapt to your business changes, and IT becomes an enabler and not a cost center. But where do you start? So when you start to look at decomposing the capabilities within your existing application, one way to kick this off is through what's known as event storming. So event storming is actually quite a simple technique, but the goal of it is to use a tactile approach and involve technical teams as well as deep business specialists. And the idea is that you're able to map out and define processes and triggers that result in what's called a domain event. With this, you are able to ensure that you can build those business rules that are necessary for those services to function. So how do you start off with event storming? So you identify the business process that you have in mind. So we'll look at this insurance company again. And in our case, we have this business process of a claim. So imagine a customer submits a claim. It goes through various stages, and within those stages, what they call are triggers. And these triggers in itself link to another trigger. They may link to another process, another event. Ultimately, they get to the point where you're able to describe the entire process from end to end. By doing this, what you ensure is that you're matching the business rules. You use that to build your business rules and your business logic. By doing that, you're ensuring that the software you're going to deliver to your business is going to meet their needs. So this is the first thing that typically before you start to get hands-on onto the console and start modifying your classes and compiling libraries, this is what you want to start off with. And the key here is to engage with the business and engage with the domain specialists. Now, if we look at specific decomposition strategies, the first one we'll talk about is decomposition by auxiliary service. So here we're not talking about features or functionality that's related to a specific business unit. So think of this diagram as a single application that serves these 4 business units. But aside of that, you have these auxiliary services. So these are services that enable this business logic. So think of it as authentication or authorization. Now, when you start to modernize your applications and you start to change your pipelines, you start to change your operating model, you want to pick those, start with the sort of the not relatively easy ones first. So in this case, I have an authentication service and authorizations service, and that could represent 100 lines of code. I could easily replace that with 2 API calls to external services. And immediately, I'm able to start to retire some lines of code. Then we start to get into more complex stuff. So again, we're using this insurance company, and the first one is decomposing by business capability. So when you do this, you effectively start to build this. You start to build a truly distributed system. You have distributed teams that function totally independently, and they easily align to business value. It can be easily measured. However, it requires a deep understanding of those business domains, and you have to engage with your business experts. The next one is decomposition by business transaction. So here, think of it as, in this example, we've got the sales and customers as one business unit, and we're coupling all the activities or all the activities related to a single transaction into one service. What that means is, though, you now have faster response times because you have all your queries remain local, as an example. You also have you don't have data consistency issues anymore because it's all contained again within those services. You still have improved availability over your monolithic application, but here the biggest risk lies in you can end up with a distributed monolith. The next one you think about is decomposing by teams. So you got this agile approach of working. You've got product owners assigned. You've got technical people. You've got some business specialists, and then you start to refactor applications per team. Now, what that gives you, though, is that your teams have the flexibility in choosing their libraries, their frameworks, the data stores they need to use. But it's harder to show business value because it's harder to align those teams to business capability. The other thing is that you could also have further bottlenecks if there's interdependencies between teams. And then the last one is on decomposition patterns is this decomposition by a business subdomain. So again, we're looking at our insurance company. We got four business units or 4 key functions within the business. Again, you get the benefits of a distributed system. You have the scalability. The components scale independently. Your teams are available to choose any technology, any data store, or any programming language they want to do. And this is closely modeled around the business. Again, one of the things that are important when you consider this is that you have to involve your business specialists, and this just can't be done in isolation by technical teams. So if we break this down now into subdomains, what we're doing here is we are getting this as close as possible to represent how the business functions. Now you may think about this, okay, this is complicated, which it is, and this may also result in additional infrastructure to provision, because You would have to provision additional accounts, for isolation, for limits, service limits, etc. So this is one of the sort of the most complex ones, but at the same time, this one is going to offer you the highest business value because it's so closely related to the actual business. The good thing, though, is that you can apply event storming and elements of domain-driven design to be able to work closely with your business people and your technical people to find those subdomains and make sure they modeled against the business. So Carlos took you through the strangler fig pattern and how that applies from an infrastructure perspective. But what happens now, as you have your monolith application, and you start to, over time, gradually extract capability into independent services. They're contained within their own AWS accounts. So that's okay if you have one or two services. But what happens when you extend into the 10s, the 20s, and beyond? You're now having to provision accounts. You're having to baseline them. You apply your guardrails, all your security and governance rules that you need to apply. That in itself is a massive undertaking, let alone the decomposition of the actual code. Now, with the addition of refactor spaces, which is a new capability within the Migration Hub, refactor spaces basically allows you to configure your existing application, your monolith, and microservices. So this could be gradually extracting using the strangler pattern, or adding directly new features into brand new services as a single application. From talking to our customers, the biggest, one of the challenges they have is when they come to refactoring their application, is not just what we talked about, extracting the code and capabilities, but is also building the infrastructure to support that. In itself, that could take days, even weeks. With refactor spaces, you're now able to do that in a matter of days. So refactor spaces basically allows you, it sets up the infrastructure for refactoring, rewriting, and re-architecting your applications based on that strangler pattern. It allows you to build large-scale applications, but allows you to do that, your existing application and your new services to coexist and function as a single application. So what does a refactor space automate? It sets up the transit gateway, the VPC connections to form a networking bridge to allow it to communicate with backend services. It sets up the API gateway so you can proxy user requests through the API gateway, and then back to backend route through to old and new services as needed. So before we go into a demo, we want to introduce you to some concepts that originate with refactor spaces. You got this idea of an environment. The environment is typically is where the nuts and bolts live for your refactor spaces infrastructure. So this would be in a dedicated account. You may have a infrastructure team managing that. Once you've set up your refactor spaces environment, you go and create an application. The application includes your legacy or monolithic application, plus your additional services that you start to extract or start to build net new. And then you have the routing. This is service-based routing that goes to a Lambda function or through a service running within a VPC. So what this looks like when you go into the management console, when you get back to work on Monday and you start to tinker with this, what you'll start with first is that you'll create the environment. And then what the environment will do is it will set up the transit gateway. The next step is you start to associate your accounts with the environment. So you start to share your accounts. So you start off with the monolith you migrated initially, and then you start to construct this concept of application we talked about. So the application is this single unit. And then when you create the application, Refactor Space will start to configure the API gateway and build this network bridge through NLBs so that eventually it can get to the end service. And then you start to create your services. So this is just your new services or the ones you've extracting incrementally. And then finally, you define your routing. Your routing is based on whichever a service endpoint. So in the case of the monolith, that could be in a VPC talking to Amazon EC2 instances. In the case of my new microservices, it could be through a application load balancer to a Fargate cluster. So now we'll go into a short demo. And whilst I try to get this set up, Carlos, maybe you want to say a short joke?
Yeah, well, I don't have any good one so far. So, or at least that I will tell it properly. So one of the things that, just to highlight on what Melash was saying, it has to do with retiring lines of code. What we believe is that as you're retiring lines of code in the monolith, it will help to keep your environment simpler and easier to manage. That's the concept behind that. So that's one thing to highlight there, and that's why we believe going to a microservices architecture on that part, it will help you to have that gradual migration process.
So before we actually kick off the demo, just a quick walkthrough through the process flow and the infrastructure. So think of this as your typical 3-tier web application. In this case, we're using Amazon S3 to serve static files. And then we've got an Amazon EC2 instance running multiple services. All that's persisted to a MySQL database. Okay, so now we're basically just connecting to the application through the Amazon EC2 instance, or we're pretty much just replicating some activity, so adding some items to the shopping cart. And here, bring this back a bit. I went too fast. So we're now in the Refactor Spaces console, and the first thing we're going to do is create the environment. And the environment, you typically fill in all the parameters you have, like the name and the permissions you're going to work with. You then lead into the next screen. The next step is we'll set up the application. So here we'll have the monolith, so the 3-tier web app, and then we'll have, and later on, we'll start to extract some functionality into some Lambda functions. We're going to go ahead and define the application. We set up a proxy VPC, so this is for Refactor Spaces to communicate. And here we go and add the account IDs for our new services. Finally, we create the environment and we share it. So now what we have is we have users still connecting into directly into the web server and EC2 instances, excuse me. But what you do see now in terms of infrastructure provision is that Refactor Spaces has set up the environment and all the nuts and bolts in terms of networking that will be needed once you start to build it up as a single application.
Yeah, and the aim here, like with many services or features like this, is that you don't need to do need to do all this scaffolding in the background. You don't need to set up this. As I was saying in the beginning, this has been done by our customers in the past. This feature was the result of some feedback we received, like many others. So here we are creating a feature that is part of the service that is creating the environment for you, and it will help you to manage it as well. So you don't need to, you can do all this manually, or you can create it and handle it yourself. Here what we are looking is to abstract that complexity and help you to create it and manage it.
At this point, we start to define services and the routes, and hope this should change soon. There we go. So what you're going to see, though, is the capability that's been extracted is actually consists of 3 Lambda functions. So basically, what was happening here is you're creating 3 services, and they point to Lambda endpoints. And once we go through this process, we'll go back into the Refactor Spaces console and look at the resources provisioned. So at the moment, what we're doing now is we're still connecting to the EC2 instance. So that's the very first step we added. We also added now here, you'll see that it goes about creating the routes to backend services. And the source path here defines that. What this means is this is saying that anything destined for this sort of pathway will go route to the monolith application. And if we define, as we start to create more services, we'll define more source paths that Refactor Spaces will set up. So I'm going to change this URL to the API gateway. And now we're accessing the monolith application through the API gateway, so basically through the Refactor Spaces environment. So it looks something like this. You still have all the features and capabilities within the EC2 instance, but you are proxying it through Refactor Spaces. I now go into my microservices account, and I accept the sharing notification. And now we start to set up our Lambda functions. So here we're going to create services. And the source path is where we're going to attach our HTTP verbs. So we repeat this process until we've extracted all our capability. And this should be the last one in terms of Lambda functions. And it looks something like this. If I go into API Gateway, what I see now is the resources that Refactor Space has provisioned. So here you can see the endpoint is the legacy application, and then the endpoints for Lambda functions. And there's our capability extracted. Here's the resources that Refactor Spaces has provisioned in terms of API Gateway. So that's what it looks like now. We have users connecting through Refactor Spaces, and ultimately either, depending on what's requested, either back to the Amazon EC2 instance or to the new service extracted, the new capability that's represented as Lambda functions. So what we're going to do now is we're going to add more items to the shopping cart. And again, we're accessing this through Refactor Spaces. And we've got 3 items there, so let's remove one just to prove that we're making some changes, because we don't have any front-end changes here. So what we're going to do next is we'll go into the actual DynamoDB table just to confirm there's 2 items remaining. So in my DynamoDB table, I have 2 items because I removed one. So that's one way of proving those changes. We'll go back into the Lambda console. We'll go into the Lambda functions. And now we can have a look at the invocations. So we should expect to see 3 invocations because we had 3 Lambda functions called. And we should see a 100% success rate. And that's a short demo.
Perfect. Thank you, Melash. Something that we were talking about here is how do we abstract the complexity of creating the environment, of the networking setup that you need to have, the API gateway setup, and having this feature will help you to get started now in minutes versus trying to figure out everything by yourself. We have few sessions listed here. Some of them already happened, and the recordings are or will be available. There is one in particular here, the 402, that talks about how you manage the accounts that are resulting from this process. Because another common question from our customers is, great, yeah, now I'm creating different AWS accounts, but that's adding complexity to my setup. So how do I manage that efficiently? And that's where other services that are compounding that or abstracting that complexity for you will help, like AWS Control Tower. So some of the related sessions are here for your reference. And just to wrap up, and by the way, some of you may say that these are very wordy slides, and you will be right. But the nice thing is that you will be able to keep them as we are going through this in the recording as well. So we cover here it's the 2-phase approach, right? How do we use a strangler fig? How do you use event storming, event domain to identify how you are going to decide how you are going to move different pieces and functionality of your applications, how do you justify the move to a new scheme, how do you manage the complexity and keep reducing that complexity that will reduce to more agility and lower cost. So that incremental approach, we are looking to enable that through refactor spaces, and especially having that API gateway that is allowing you to have behind the scenes the architecture that you want for a set of microservices. Now, you decompose that, as I was saying, through event storming. You start decomposing slowly. Especially, you are able to handle risk. You can go as quick as you are comfortable in terms of risk, as quick as your organization is comfortable to follow. And then you will have business objectives. Something key that Melash touched on, it's you are teaming with the business. That's a key part of this proposal on what's going to go first, how you are going to be decomposing, and what pieces of functionality will be going out first. So what we want is here at the end, it's de-risk and have migration hub refactor spaces, automating that part, and we manage it for you. It's an environment that should keep things simple and clean for you, and especially will allow you with the incremental piece. So, with the incremental approach. So, what is the call to action, or what we invite you to do? It's we launch on Monday a public preview of refactor spaces in the migration hub console. So you can launch it now as part of this process. Of the preview process, it doesn't have any cost associated with it. As we go for GA, more details will be provided. But you can see the details of the service. You can create the environment. You can follow the steps that Melash was walking us through that way. So we invite you to do that. We invite you, if you have this need, to go through this process, and especially during the preview, at any point, your feedback and it's welcome. You can start operating. You can start playing with these concepts. You can identify how you can have a monolith and the microservices working as a single unit. That's something that will require some of that. Will abstract the initial setup, and you can identify the best ways that will benefit your priorities. And then the one of the items that we want at the end of all this is that the how you do it is how you are setting up all this networking, all these API items, API gateway items that you are configuring, that you do it in a simpler, faster way, and you focus on what are the business processes and what are the priorities that you are defining with your business. So please, we have an email there. Feel free to reach out there or individually to any of us. I know we will have some time here. We don't have a microphone here in the room, but we'll be happy to stay here for a few minutes and answer any questions that you may have. So with that said, anything else you wanted to add, Melash?
No, that's it. Thank you. Thank you for your time, and have a good evening.
Thank you.